My son poured that glass of wine with both hands, the way he used to pour cereal as a little boy, careful and deliberate like it mattered. That's what made me pause. Thomas had never once cared about pouring anyone a drink in his life. It was my 68th birthday. The dining room smelled like roast chicken, and the clove candles my daughter-in-law Amanda always brought, the kind that were supposed to smell like Christmas but just smelled like a dentist's waiting room. The table was set nicely. I'll give her that. Cloth napkins, the good plates, a little card propped against my water glass that said "Happy Birthday," Mom in Amanda's loopy handwriting with a printed rose in the corner. Thomas sat across from me, his hair thinner than I remembered, his smile wider than usual, and he handed me the glass of red wine with that same deliberate care and said, "I picked this one especially for you, Mum. Go on, try it." I looked at the wine. Deep red, almost purple. I looked at Thomas. His eyes didn't move from my glass. I don't know what made me reach for Sophie's orange juice instead. She was sitting beside me, my granddaughter, 19 years old and home from Dalhousie for the long weekend. She rolled her eyes at the juice like she'd rather have had the wine herself, and I said quietly, "Trade with your old grandmother, sweetheart," and she shrugged and took my glass without a second thought. Thomas laughed too quickly. "Mum, that's Sophie's drink." He slid the wine glass an inch closer to me. "Come on, I opened it just for you." But Sophie had already taken a sip of the wine. Because that's who Sophie is, she doesn't think twice. She just does. And I sat back and watched. And I watched Thomas watching her. And I watched the smile on his face go very, very still. 20 minutes later, Sophie said she felt dizzy. 40 minutes after that, she was in the bathroom. By the time Amanda drove her to the urgent care clinic off Commissioner's Road, Sophie was pale as January and could barely keep her eyes open. I sat alone in the dining room while they were gone. The roast chicken went cold. The clove candles burned down to nothing. I did not touch the wine. I drove myself home that night in the dark, down the long, flat stretch of highway between their subdivision and my house in Port Stanley. The lake was black and enormous on my left, and I drove slowly, more slowly than I needed to, because something had settled into my chest that I knew would take time to understand. Not panic, not fear, something quieter. The kind of thing you feel when you've been looking at a photograph for years and you finally notice what's actually in the background. Sophie called me the next morning from the clinic. She'd been kept overnight for observation. The doctor said it looked like a reaction to something she'd ingested, possibly a sedative, possibly something she'd eaten. She didn't have any known allergies. She said she felt stupid for not being able to figure out what had happened. I told her she hadn't done anything wrong. I told her she had done everything exactly right. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table in Elgin County with my tea going cold, and I thought about my son. Not the Thomas who called me every Sunday and remembered to ask about my book club, the other one, the one who had, over the past 3 years, begun looking at my house the way strangers look at houses that are for sale. I'd bought this house with my late husband, Robert, in 1991, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a view of the lake on clear days if you stood on the second step of the back deck and tilted your head just right. Robert died of a heart attack 7 years ago, 2 weeks after our anniversary, and I had been alone in the house ever since. I liked it. I had my routine, my garden, my neighbor Patricia, my Wednesday book club. I was not lonely. I was not confused. I was not incapable. But Thomas had started calling it a lot of house for one person. Amanda had started suggesting I look at some of the newer builds in their development, smaller, single-level, easier to manage. Last spring, Thomas had brought over a folder of brochures for retirement communities and set them on the kitchen table the way you'd set down evidence. "Just to think about," he'd said. "We worry, Mum. You're alone out here." I was 68 years old. I'd worked as a registered nurse for 34 years at St. Joseph's. I managed my own finances, drove my own car, paid my own taxes, and had never once asked Thomas for anything except to please stop leaving his boots in my front hall. But worry, as Thomas used it, was a word with a flexible meaning. That morning after the hospital, I went to my filing cabinet. The tall gray one in the spare room that Robert had always called the archive, half joking, because I kept everything: property tax records, RRSP statements, insurance policies, Sophie's birthday cards going back to when she was 3. And at the back of the third drawer, a manila envelope Thomas had given me 14 months ago. "It's just paperwork, Mum," he'd said when he brought it over. "Your financial advisor suggested it. You know, in case anything ever happens, so I can step in without things getting tied up in probate. Standard stuff." I'd trusted him. He was my son. I'd watched him take his first steps on this very floor. I opened the envelope now and read every page for the first time. It was a continuing power of attorney for property. Ontario Standard Form, notarized, signed with my signature. It gave Thomas full and immediate authority over my financial affairs, not upon incapacity, not after a doctor's assessment. Immediate, active from the date of signing. I read it again. My signature was there at the bottom, shaky, rushed, the signature of a woman who hadn't understood what she was agreeing to. I also found something else in that drawer that morning, a paper I didn't recognize, a transfer authorization form from my bank, TD Canada Trust, moving $800 monthly to an external account. The account number was not one I recognized. The form had my signature on it, the same shaky hand. I had no memory of signing this. The transfers had been running for 11 months. I closed the drawer. I stood very still in the middle of the spare room. Then I went and made another cup of tea. Sophie was discharged by early afternoon. She called me from the car and her voice was steadier, but I could hear the uncertainty in it, the way 19-year-olds sound when something has frightened them and they don't yet have the language for it. The doctor said it might have been a reaction to tannins or something, she said. He wasn't sure. Dad called and said the same thing. He seemed really relieved. He kept saying it was probably just the wine. I said, "Of course he did." There was a pause on the line. "Grandma, are you okay?" "I'm going to be," I said. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Okay. Before dinner last night, did you see anything in the kitchen? Did you see your father near the wine?" Another pause, longer, then quietly. "He was in there alone for a few minutes before he called us to the table. I didn't think anything of it. He had the bottle and a little glass dropper thing, like the kind you use for bitters. I thought it was bitters. My tea had gone cold again. I didn't drink it. "Sophie," I said, "I want you to keep this between us for now. Don't mention it to your parents. Don't change anything. Just go home and act normal." "Grandma, what is—" "I promise I'll explain, but not yet." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay, I trust you." I don't think I'd heard those 3 words said to me in years. I held on to them for a minute before I let myself move. The next morning, I drove to London, not to the hospital, not to Thomas's house, to the office of my lawyer, Catherine Park, who had handled Robert's estate and who I trusted with the particular trust you reserve for people who have seen you grieve and handled your paperwork with equal care. I laid the documents out on her desk. The continuing power of attorney, the transfer authorization, the envelope. She read through them slowly, taking off her reading glasses once and then putting them back on. "Eleanor," she said, "did you understand what you were signing here?" "No," I said. "I understand it now." She looked at the dates. "These transfers have been running since February of last year, approximately $8,800. I didn't flinch. "I want to revoke the power of attorney today. I want to stop those transfers. And I want to know what else I should be doing." Catherine nodded. "We revoke it in writing, notarized. I'll have it to the bank by end of day." "But Eleanor," she paused, "do you understand that if your son disputes this, if he claims you're not capable of making this decision—" "I drove myself here," I said. "I read those documents myself. I've kept every financial record for 30 years. If he wants to argue my competence, he's welcome to try." She almost smiled. I'd like to also recommend a continuing power of attorney for personal care, naming someone you trust. If the wrong person currently holds authority over your medical decisions as well. Does he? She checked the documents. Not the medical one, no, just property. But given what you've described about last night, I think we should make sure everything is clearly documented and properly assigned. My granddaughter, I said. Sophie. She's 19, second year at Dal. She's the only person in my family who's told me the truth lately. Catherine wrote it down. We'll need a co-trustee for financial matters until she's 21 under the Substitute Decisions Act. I can recommend a neutral party, but for personal care, she can be named now. Do it, I said. We spent 2 hours in that office. Catherine read every clause aloud and waited for me to confirm I understood before moving on. When I signed the new documents, my hand was steady. I don't know that it had ever been steadier. On the way home, I stopped at the TD branch on Wellington. The branch manager was a soft-spoken man named Derek, who wore a green tie and who looked slightly alarmed when I laid the revocation notice and the new power of attorney on his desk. I want those monthly transfers canceled immediately, I said. And I want a full account history for the past 18 months. All activity. All authorizations on file. He clicked through his computer with the careful expression of someone who has just realized he is in the middle of something. Mrs. Collins, there is an active continuing power of attorney on file granting access to a joint authorization. Not anymore, I said. That document has been revoked as of today. My lawyer has sent confirmation. If you need to verify, Catherine Park's number is on the letterhead. He made a quiet phone call. When he came back, his manner had changed, slightly more careful, more respectful, in the way people become when they realize a situation is more serious than it first appeared. The transfers have been stopped, he said, and I should let you know there were also 2 additional withdrawals flagged as in-person transactions, 6 months ago and 3 months ago, $2,000 each. The teller record shows they were processed under the authorized signatory, Thomas. I did not make those withdrawals, I said. Derek lowered his voice. We'll flag this for our elder financial abuse team. That's standard procedure in a situation like this. You may receive a call from them within 48 hours. Good, I said. Before I left, I asked him to print me the full 18 months of statements and place a restriction on the account requiring in-person verification for any future changes. No phone, no online amendments. He nodded and handed me a folder thick enough to use as a doorstop. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and the radio off. That evening I sat at the kitchen table and went through every page. There were the monthly transfers, $900, steady as rent. There were the 2 cash withdrawals. There was a charge to a business account I didn't recognize, $1,400, listed under property maintenance. There was nothing in my house that had been maintained in the last 3 months, except the eavesdrows, which I'd paid a local man named Earl to clean for $120. I wrote down every number. I made a second column with dates. I cross-referenced with my household ledger, the green one Robert started, and I'd kept going since 1991. Every dollar I'd spent in this house, every loan I'd made to Thomas over the years was in that ledger. The $6,000 I'd given him when he lost his job during the 2009 recession. The $4,500 for the down payment on their first car. The $11,000 to cover the cost overrun on their basement renovation 2 years ago. Amanda's gallbladder surgery when their benefits hadn't kicked in yet. Sophie's first year of tuition, which I'd given gladly, the only number on the page I didn't resent. I closed the ledger. Then I opened it again and wrote the date at the top of a new page. I wrote the amount of money that had been taken without my knowledge. I wrote, "Not anymore," and underlined it twice. Sophie texted at 9 that night. "Just checking on you, Grandma. Mom and Dad are acting strange. Dad asked me twice if I'd said anything to you." I replied, "I'm fine, don't worry." "Did you tell him anything?" "No. You said not to. Is everything okay?" "It will be, I promise." "How's your head?" "Better." Still a bit off. The doctor said it could take a couple days. I stared at that message for a long time. She was 19 and at university, and she'd spent her birthday weekend in an urgent care clinic because she drank something that was meant for me, and she still texted to check on me. I replied, "I love you. Get some sleep. We'll talk properly soon." Thomas called the following afternoon. I let it ring. He called again. On the third call, I picked up. "Mum." His voice had that careful cheerfulness people use when they know they're walking towards something difficult and want to pretend they don't. Just calling to check in. "How are you feeling?" Big birthday weekend. All that excitement with Sophie. "I spoke to my lawyer yesterday," I said. Silence. "And my bank." More silence. Then, "Is everything okay?" "The power of attorney you had me sign has been revoked," I said. "The automatic transfers have been stopped. The bank is looking into the unauthorized withdrawals." "Mum." His voice shifted. Careful cheerfulness gone. Something flatter underneath. "I think you might be confusing." "I'm not confused," I said. "I read the documents, both copies. I've kept every financial record for 30 years. I know exactly what was signed and what was taken. I was protecting you. You're alone out there, you don't. I'm 68 years old, Thomas. I spent 34 years making critical decisions about people's lives in a hospital. I am not confused, and I am not alone in the way you seem to need me to be." A long pause. "We need to talk. In person." "We're talking now," I said. "Amanda and I are just worried. You've been forgetful. I haven't been forgetful. You've been telling people I'm forgetful. There's a difference." He went quiet in a different way then. Not defensive. Calculating. "Sophie drank that wine," I said. "That was an allergic reaction," the doctor said. "Sophie doesn't have allergies, Thomas. And you had a glass dropper in your hand in the kitchen before dinner." The silence that followed was not innocent. "If anything happens to me," I said, my voice very even, "the people who investigate will know exactly where to start. I've made sure of that." He hung up. I set the phone down on the table and looked out at the lake. The light was the color of old brass in the late afternoon, the way it gets in November in Elgin County, low and honest. I had loved this view for 33 years. I had not been willing to look at it clearly enough until now. Sophie came that Friday. She took the 401 bus from London and walked from the stop at the corner carrying her backpack and a bag from the Ukrainian bakery on Talbot Street, the one with the rye bread I liked. She came through the back door the way she always had, since she was small enough that I had to lift her up to reach the handle. She sat across from me and put her hands around a mug of tea and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. All of it. The documents, the bank, the phone call. I watched her face move through several expressions, none of them simple. By the end, she was very still. "I have something to show you," she said quietly. She pulled out her phone. She opened a video file dated the evening of my birthday, time-stamped from her camera roll. She'd been recording earlier, she explained. Just a boomerang of the table settings to send to a friend. She hadn't realized what else she'd caught until she watched it back in the hospital. In the video, the dining room was empty except for Thomas, standing at the kitchen counter with his back half turned. You could see the wine bottle. You could see his hand, and in his hand, something small and dark, a glass vial with a rubber dropper top. He held it over the open bottle. The camera angle was partial but clear enough. He tipped the dropper. Once, then again. The video lasted 41 seconds. I watched it twice. "I didn't know what to do," Sophie said. Her voice was very careful, the voice of someone holding something fragile. "I've been going back and forth since I got home. He's my dad, but then I keep thinking that was your drink, Grandma. And he didn't even come to the hospital. He called once." "He called once," I said. "If you'd drunk that—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," I said. She looked at her phone. "What do I do with this?" "You send it to me," I said. "And then we go see my lawyer." Catherine Park looked at the video 3 times. Then she sat back in her chair and took off her reading glasses and looked at me. "Eleanor," she said, "this changes the scope of what we're dealing with. I know. I need to be clear with you about what the options are. At the civil level, we've already revoked the POA and flagged the financial irregularities. That process is underway. But if you want to take this further, I want it on record," I said. "Everything. I want a formal record so that if anything happens to me, there is no ambiguity about where to look." "Then we file with the police," she said. "And I'd recommend contacting the Public Guardian and Trustee of Ontario. They have jurisdiction over financial exploitation of vulnerable adults." "I'm not a vulnerable adult." "No," she said. "But the law was written to protect people from exactly this. You don't have to be vulnerable to use it. You just have to have been targeted." Sophie sat beside me through the whole meeting. She didn't say much, but she was present, the way certain people are present steadily, without drama, in a way that made the room feel more solid. When the meeting ended and Catherine walked us to the door, Sophie reached over and took my hand briefly and let go again. We went to the police station that same afternoon. The detachment on Talbot, 10 minutes from my house. The officer was a young woman, Constable Fairweather, whose handshake was very firm and who listened to everything I said without interrupting once. I gave her the video file. I gave her copies of the bank records and the revoked power of attorney. I gave her Catherine's written summary of the financial irregularities. I gave her the dropper bottle, which I had thought to bring in a small plastic bag taken from Thomas's kitchen cabinet that I'd noticed during a visit last spring and had not thought about again until 2 days ago. Constable Fairweather looked at the dropper bottle for a long time. "Mrs. Collins," she said, "I want to be straightforward with you. What you're describing, the substance added to the drink, the financial control, the timing, this is something we take very seriously. We'll need to send the bottle for analysis, and we'll need a formal statement from your granddaughter as well." Sophie gave her statement that afternoon. She was composed and precise and did not hedge any detail. When she came back out to the waiting area, she sat down next to me and let out a long breath. "That was harder than an exam," she said. "You did well," I said. "What happens now?" "We wait," I said, "and we keep our eyes open." The letter arrived 8 days later. White envelope, no return address, my name in block letters on the front. Inside, a single typed page. It informed me that my behavior had been distressing to my family, that my recent actions constituted harassment, and that if I continued to make accusations, they reserved the right to pursue legal options. It was unsigned, but the wording had Amanda in it, the precision of someone who'd once worked in an HR department and believed in documented trails. I read it once. I set it on the table. I called Constable Fairweather and told her I'd received it. She told me to keep it. I wrote one reply. Typed, short, factual. I told them that all authorizations had been formally revoked and documented. I told them that a formal complaint had been filed with the police and that a copy of the financial irregularity report had been submitted to the Public Guardian and Trustee. I told them that any further contact not initiated through legal counsel would be treated as harassment and documented accordingly. I signed it with my full name. I mailed it certified. Then I called Patricia next door and asked if she wanted to walk down to the beach. It was early December, and the lake was frozen along the edges. We walked without hurrying, the way you walk when you're not going anywhere in particular, and I told her some of it, not all. Enough that she could understand why I seemed quieter than usual. Patricia had known Robert. She'd brought soup when he died. She didn't say much, just walked beside me and listened, and when we turned around to head back, she said, "Eleanor, I always said you were the most capable woman I knew." "I almost wasn't," I said. "But you were," she said. "That's the only part that counts." Thomas called twice more that week. I didn't answer. Amanda sent a text that said they were worried about my mental state and were looking into getting me assessed. I forwarded it to Constable Fairweather. She told me the investigation had been upgraded and that I'd be hearing from the detective assigned to the case. Sophie came back the weekend before Christmas. She arrived with her sketchbook and a box of shortbread from a Halifax shop she liked, and she sat in the kitchen while I made soup and didn't talk about any of it for a while. Sometimes that's the right thing to do. Sometimes you need to let the difficult things sit quietly in the room for a bit before you name them. When we finally did talk, she told me that her parents had told her she wasn't allowed to see me. Amanda had said I was unstable. Thomas had said I was confusing everyone with paranoia. Sophie had listened to all of it, she said, and then she'd driven 2 hours anyway. Was that hard? I asked. Yes, she said simply. He's my dad. I looked at her across the table. She was 19 and she looked very tired and very clear-eyed at the same time. Sophie, I said, I want to give you something. I got up and went to the spare room and came back with a folder from Catherine's office. I set it in front of her. She opened it slowly, read the first page. Her face changed. What is this? A trust account in your name, I said, at RBC. For your education, your future, your freedom. I've funded it directly from my investment account. The amount is yours entirely, no conditions, no strings. Thomas's name is not on it, and he has no access to any account of mine that remains. Grandma, the amount, I said, is equal to what was taken from me over the past year. I decided it should go to the right person. She sat for a long time looking at the document. When she looked up, her eyes were full. You didn't have to. I wanted to, I said, because you've never once taken anything from me. You've only ever tried to understand. And at 19 years old, you sat in a police station and gave a statement that most adults in your situation wouldn't have had the courage to give. She came around the table and hugged me. No words. I held on and felt the solidness of her, this person I had watched grow up, who had grown, somehow, into someone I trusted entirely. After she left, I made a pot of tea and sat at the table and let the house be quiet around me. The lake was just visible through the kitchen window, steel blue and wide and completely indifferent, the way it always was, the way I'd always loved it for being. The phone rang once Thomas and I watched his name appear and disappear on the screen. Then I took out the green household ledger and opened to a new page and wrote the date at the top. Underneath it I wrote, what I know, what I protected, what I kept. I didn't fill it in that night. I just let the page be blank for a while, clean and available, the way a good beginning always is. The detective called 2 days before Christmas. His name was Sergeant Morin. Calm voice, careful phrasing. He told me the substance in the dropper bottle had been sent to the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto, and that results were expected in the new year. He told me the financial investigation was ongoing and that I might be called to give a supplementary statement. He asked if I felt safe. I told him I felt safer than I had in 3 years. He said that was good to hear. On Christmas Eve, I drove to Patricia's, and we had dinner with her daughter and her son-in-law and 3 grandchildren who ran around the living room in their socks and knocked over a small wooden reindeer twice and were thoroughly forgiven for it. I ate too much and laughed at things that were only mildly funny and drove home under a sky that was thick with cloud and felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely like myself. I didn't hear from Thomas that Christmas. Not a message, not a call. The silence he left was not the kind that heals, but it was mine, and I had stopped confusing his absence with my loss. What they hadn't understood, either of them, was that this house and this life were not a problem to be managed. I was not a situation to be resolved. I had held this family together through recession and illness and grief. I had worked night shifts and driven through ice storms and sat with dying patients and come home and made breakfast and done it again. I had kept every record, paid every bill, carried every year of this life with both hands. They had looked at me and seen an old woman in a big house. What they hadn't seen, what they had so badly miscalculated, was that old women in big houses have been watching and waiting and keeping records for a very long time. In January, the lab results came back. Sergeant Morin called on a Tuesday morning, cold and clear outside my kitchen window, the lake showing in patches between the ice. Mrs. Collins, he said. The substance in the dropper bottle was identified as a benzodiazepine, a sedative. Not a lethal dose at the amount found, but sufficient to cause disorientation, confusion, possible loss of coordination. In a woman your age, given your allergy history and current medications, the effects could have been significant. I held the phone and said nothing for a moment. Charges are being considered, he said. Your son and daughter-in-law have both been interviewed. I want you to know that your file, your documents, your bank records, the video that was exactly what we needed. I've been keeping records for 30 years, I said. It shows, he said. Mrs. Collins, on behalf of the investigators involved in this case, I want to say that what you did, the methodical way you gathered and protected this evidence, it made all the difference. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a while. Then I called Sophie. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did. It's moving forward, I said. A pause, then a long, slow exhale. Are you okay, Grandma? I'm good, I said. And meant it. I'm very good. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm proud of you. I smiled at the table, at the ledger, at the window, at the lake beyond it, wide and unchanged. I know, I said. I'm proud of me too. That's something I haven't said in a long time. Later, I walked down to the beach. The ice had crept further along the shoreline, and the cold was the clean, dry kind that comes in February, the kind that makes everything sharp and precise. I stood at the edge of the water for a while, just standing, just breathing. 68 years old, retired nurse, widow, grandmother, woman who kept records. They had thought the story of my life was winding down, something to be administered and tidied and managed toward a quiet conclusion. They had thought I was past the age of fighting back. What they had never understood was that I hadn't been fighting back. I had simply, finally, stopped being polite about the truth. I turned and walked back to my house, unlocked the back door, put the kettle on, sat down at the kitchen table in the winter light. There was more to come, I knew. Court dates, perhaps. Difficult conversations. A chapter of the family story that would leave permanent marks. But I had something now I hadn't had in years. A future that belonged to me, shaped by my own hands, witnessed by someone I trusted, locked away where no one with polished smiles and careful paperwork could reach it. The kettle began to whistle. I got up and poured the water. Outside, the lake was bright and enormous and completely, peacefully mine.